So I appreciate the way that my predecessor ended his presentation because, I'm sort of seeking to find an answer to that question of how did people, women in particular, who were nurses, how did they become people who were committing these crimes? I do not have a PowerPoint. I missed the group text that we were all bringing one. So I am just reading my presentation. And I will be happy to have questions after. Pauline Neisler was born in 1900 to an ethnically German family in southern Ukraine. And after fleeing to Germany in response to the Bolshevik Revolution, she began studying nursing in 1920. Neisler became a Nazi Party member in 1937, though she was active in many other political and social organizations and enjoyed singing in her church choir. By 1945, she had assisted with the murder of an innocent person almost every day for 5 years. She was a nurse at Greifneck Castle, an institution for the disabled and mentally ill, and a participant in the Nazi euthanasia program. During the Third Reich, the government initiated a program to cull useless eaters from the German population. To most people, murder is an activity incompatible with nursing. How did Neisler, an unassuming farm girl from the Ukraine, become a career killer under Nazism? Under the Nazi regime, notions of gendered identities and roles became drastically more rigid and diametrically opposed than they had been in years prior. Racially valuable women became most treasured as wellsprings of desirable genetics that could be used to build the new Germany. The regime stressed that women were most useful as mothers and homemakers and were in fact naturally inclined towards those activities. Men, on the other hand, are portrayed in Nazi speeches and propaganda as strong, virulent soldiers and protectors of the family. With such rigidly defined and polarized gender roles, it is even more inconceivable that the government would permit, indeed institutionalize, women directly committing violence, which is an activity typically considered the preserve of masculinity. This apparent contradiction begs the question, how did the Nazi regime justify this behavior and manipulate their definition of a proper Aryan woman to kill while socializing them to be gentle, kind, and merciful? How did authorities speak about this work so as to make it appear consistent with the barrage of messages they were sending women about their natural inclinations and appropriate behaviors? My argument in this paper is that the regime situated euthanasia in the crossroads of nurses' responsibilities as Germans, as women, and as medical professionals. The government framed it as a wartime necessity, a motherly activity, and a medically sound decision for the health of the Volk. Aryan female nurses were operating within a complex network of intersecting pressures to participate. All three of these identities worked together to reinforce one another and bind some women within this web of violence. The profession of nursing in Germany underwent many radical changes during the 1920s and 30s, some of which were a result of Nazism, and some of which were international trends that took hold in Germany as they did elsewhere. Several of these changes served to influence nurses to participate in the euthanasia program. The first is the rise of eugenics and other forms of race science in Germany and abroad. Eugenics was an accepted science at the time and taught in many medical schools, laying the foundation for nurses and other medical professionals to view the lives of the disabled as detrimental to a healthy community. Parallel to the eugenics movement, there was a significant shift in medical training from treatment focused on healing the individual body to treatment focused on preventative care in the interests of the community. The teachings of Erwin Leek and Karl Kotzschau were enormously influential, and in the words of Warren T. Reich, they were radically altering the major goals of medicine. The shift to Vorsorge, this emphasis on sort of what we would consider today to be public health, is in itself, not in itself an ideology that supported genocide. It's more of an attention taking care of oneself and one's community to ward off diseases before they begin. Leek, who was a physician who pioneered this movement, often referred to as the father of Nazi medicine, wrote a lengthy proposal recommending the ban of pesticides, moderation in smoking, drinking, and eating, cautious use of X-ray technology in order to prevent cancer. However, this very easily translated into a Nazi framework once combined with the eugenics education that medical professionals were getting. These two ideologies continually reinforced one another. So nurses were educated in this sort of public health process as well as the eugenics perspective, and they worked together to encourage them to participate in euthanasia efforts. In the words of Leek, one of these physicians who pioneered this effort, quote, "No doctor who takes his profession seriously, no doctor who regards the prevention of disease as his responsibility along with the treatment of disease, should resist cooperating with efforts that mean the existence or non-existence of our Volk." The third component here is the ideological acceptance of euthanasia, both in the medical world and in the general German community. In order to encourage this acceptance, the regime framed it as a merciful act, and many nurses seem to have truly believed in the kindness of euthanasia, that they were relieving individuals from their suffering. Euthanasia, according to their training, was not contrary to their profession as nurses. It was considered fully acceptable in the context of caregiving. Gertrude F., who is a nurse who worked at the Meseritz-Oberwald facility, cited mercy reasoning in her post-war trial testimony, saying that she recalled patients asking to be relieved of their illness and pain. Anna G. also spoke extensively about the caring and kind attitudes of nurses towards their patients. On giving the dissolved medicine, quote, "I proceeded with a lot of compassion. I took them in my arms lovingly and stroked them when I gave the medicine. I talked to her nicely now that she had drunk so much and told her to finish the rest, otherwise the cure would not be complete. They were not to be tortured more than necessary." Marguerite T. also emphasized her obligation to medicine, stating, "The orders given to me were within the field of my work and training. Therefore, it was not murder in their eyes, but rather another duty of being a nurse." And I would like to add a sort of a footnote that a lot of the documents that I'm working with for this project came from post-war trial testimony, which is, of course, very unreliable in terms of determining a person's actual motivations for doing something. But I think that the way that they're framing it to other people is important. It doesn't necessarily mean that they themselves believed that this act was merciful, although I think that there's strong evidence to suggest that some of them did, but they were willing to present it that way, and they thought that that would be acceptable reasoning to get them off of their crimes or get them a lighter sentence. So I think that association that they are making is important, even if we can't rely on the trial testimony to give us an accurate picture of exactly how they felt about what they did. Let's see. So it's certainly necessary to address that critique, that many of them may have overstated their compassion. It's worth noting that unlike a lot of other groups of perpetrators, female and male, they chose to emphasize their compassion rather than their obedience to authority. That certainly was a theme that we will come back to. It doesn't necessarily indicate that they were more compassionate, but they believed that they were being so, or believed that such an answer would make them more sympathetic to their juries. So it's not about, do they actually think what they're doing is merciful? Again, I think there's evidence to suggest that some of them did, but also they believed that this framing of themselves as compassionate caregivers was something that other people would find relatable in some way. This perspective was undoubtedly bolstered by their gender identities as women in an era where mercy and compassion were central to being proper women. Not all euthanasia nurses were women, but nursing as a profession was disproportionately female, and all of the testimonies that I have had access to came from women. Nursing has been framed in very feminine terms since before the Nazi regime. However, Nazism reinforced this connection in an effort to feminize nursing and position it as women being paid for what they already naturally were inclined to do. Aryan nurses saw the same posters, watched the same movies, heard the same speeches, read the same magazines as other women did. So they absorbed this hyper-feminized conception of what ideal womanhood was, even if they saw themselves as not always being a part of it. So an important component here is not that these nurses were necessarily trying to subscribe to this hyper-feminized ideal, but like women all over the world throughout, even today, they define themselves using the framework that that was prescribed for them based on their gender identity. So it's really crucial to talk about nurses as Aryan women during the Nazi regime in order to understand that, because those two things are intersecting. Nazism elevated motherhood above all other pursuits as not only the most valuable choice for women, but the only valuable choice. The Nazi regime also emphasized women's supposedly natural inclination towards qualities associated with good mothers and wives, such as mercy, kindness, frugality, compassion, subservience. This biological determinism functioned to justify the subjugation of women and their relegation to the domestic sphere, especially after the era of the new woman in the early 20th century. All women, nurses included, saw the propaganda enforcing this narrow definition of womanhood. Racially ideal, gentle women cradling babies, cooking, demonstrating physical fitness. These images were ubiquitous in the Nazi era. Women were also charged with the responsibility of safeguarding German blood. In many cultures, women are bearers of nationalistic significance via their bodies and their reproductive capacities, and Nazi Germany was no exception. The future of the Volk was in the hands of Germany's women, and it was a duty that they were expected to fulfill. Even excluding visual propaganda such as movies and posters, the Nazi government made very clear what kind of women they wanted to invest in. Symbolic gestures like the creation of Mother's Day, the awarding of Mother's Crosses, things like that. They established homes for unwed mothers, outlawed abortion, severely restricted access to information about birth control, and there was an absence of other representations of womanhood. In 25 issues of Frauenwörter, which was a Nazi women's magazine that I reviewed for this project, there were only 2 articles that spoke about women working outside the home, and they both dealt with traditionally feminine careers. Actually, both of them were about nursing. Some scholars argue that these programs failed because most German women, to quote, most German women were not married, were not constantly pregnant, and were not staying at home, or because, quote, marriage loans failed to have the sharp impact on the birth rate which had been anticipated, end quote. However, it's unwise to presume that these programs had the singular purpose of increasing the birth rate. They served to construct an image in the mind of the public of who was the ideal German woman and set up a goal for women to be measured against and strive towards. Nurses, like other women, were held up to this standard and had their choices shaped in relation to this ideal. The Nazi regime wanted to be constantly reaffirming women's proper place in the home, but it was confronted with the reality that many women still worked outside the home, despite all attempts to prevent this. In response, the propaganda extended the boundaries of women's natural responsibilities to include certain feminized careers, such as nursing. While nursing has historically been a feminine career, under Nazism, this connection was strengthened exponentially. Nurses were pictured as angelic, superhuman creatures, given uniforms that were more stylish than functional, valued primarily for their role as nurturing caregivers. That was very much the rhetoric around this. In many ways, a mother, right? But with more children, and also you get paid. So all the nurses' responsibilities were defined in these hyper-feminized terms of mercy and compassion, and this blurring of the lines between nurses as medical professionals and nurses as mothers to a large brood of children is crucial to understanding their actions during the euthanasia program, as is examining buy-in on the part of women into the Nazi program in general. Several forces converged in this space when we think about women as the bearers of the Volk, right, the ones who are going to carry on this pure German line, and nurses being charged with the health of the community at the same time. These pressures are all working together on the same person. Lastly, several forces converged on nurses specifically as Germans that encouraged them to participate in this euthanasia program. General pressures around compliance with government directives, more specific pressures surrounding euthanasia in particular. Hugo Slim, in one of his works, identifies several ingredients that come together to motivate people to kill. And many of the conditions that he identifies are relevant to the nurses here as well. So this is quoting from him: dehumanization of the enemy group, powerful forces of coercive authority, obedience and conformity, bureaucratic and euphemistic distancing, repeating and normalized killing to make it habit-forming, some form of pleasure from a social bond surrounding the killing, such as the satisfaction of a job well done, group and individual mechanisms of denial which serve to deny that one's actions were really killing, assert that it was necessary, or deny that it was bad. Of these pressures, the most commonly cited as being relevant for Aryan Germans during the Holocaust was a sense of duty and obedience. The deep and intense permeation of society by the military and militaristic values cannot be overstated in its importance. Obedience to authority, one of the military's most central values, was imported into the most private spheres in German life. Soldiers ran youth groups to train young boys in military values, such as shooting and marching. It's tempting to assume that women were isolated from that militarization, but it's not the case. By 1938, every woman enrolled in an institute of higher learning or trade school had to have completed basic training in air defense, first aid, and communications. There have been several presentations this week where we've seen that famous photo of women lying on the ground with their sniper rifles. That wasn't necessarily exceptional. Society as a whole was militarized and socialized to respond unquestioningly to authority, and nurses in particular were trained in values of subservience. The dependence on the definition of duty on the will of the supervisor is a consistent theme throughout perpetrator testimony, and we'll see with the testimony of these nurses, they were no exception. Fear and conformity acted on the lives of these nurses as well. Conformity encourages a group mentality. Quote again from Hugo Slim. Very often in the calm reflection of a Red Cross training session, armed men will think compassionately as individuals, but back in their groups and institutions, they may lose their grip on their individual moral preferences and submit to wider social pressures. And we see this again and again when we talk about perpetrators being given the option to leave their groups or their institutions and not taking that opportunity. Euthanasia nurses are no different. Out of the 12 main post-war testimonies of the nurses reviewed for this paper, 7 of them cited obligation to obey one's superiors and fear of retaliation as their primary motives for participating. It is worth noting that despite claiming fears of retribution, no nurse reported that they or anyone else had been severely reprimanded for refusing to participate. One nurse stated that she had been verbally chastised, but most others said they did not know of anyone who had been sent to camps for refusing to participate, or that they themselves eventually asked to be transferred and were not punished for it. So this reflects back again on how we use post-war trial testimony, right? Because it's not about did they really feel in their hearts that they had to obey their superiors. Maybe they did and maybe they didn't. But again, we're coming back to this is what they're choosing to represent that they feel will be a convincing argument. We also see this with Christopher Browning's famous Police Battalion 101. And this all tells us that despite being traditionally separated from male-dominated perpetrator groups, euthanasia nurses used many of the same justifications and demonstrated similar choices, showing that they experienced many of the same pressures as German men. Another factor that made perpetration easier for many nurses was the bureaucratic structure of killing that diffused responsibility across many levels of authority. In the euthanasia program, the bureaucrats drafted the program, told physicians to send reports of patients who were slated for killing, and the physicians ordered the nurses to do the killing. The bureaucrats could claim that they were only following the recommendations of physicians, and the doctors and nurses could all claim to be obeying authority, and in that way, accountability was dispersed among all parties involved without anyone feeling truly responsible. Finally, we must look at general propaganda about eugenics, disability, dehumanization of those that euthanasia targeted. The basics of eugenics and race hygiene were the fundamentals of school curriculum, particularly for women. Racially valuable girls only needed to know what would help them to keep the Volk healthy and prosperous because they were the gatekeepers of German blood. Propaganda about the disabled was taught in school, incorporated into movie reels, and inserted into magazines. They are gradually dehumanized as the regime spoke about them more and more as useless eaters. Particularly as the war escalated, euthanasia took on a nationalistic significance as a crucial step towards saving money for the war effort. Unlike propaganda aimed at increasing the birth rate, propaganda trying to dehumanize those with disabilities seemed to be effective. Though none of the nurses studied here specifically cited racial hygiene as their motive for killing, and it's unlikely that they would in a trial setting, clearly they would not have been able to commit these acts without at least a certain level of subconscious dehumanization of their targets. Hilde Wernicke, head physician at Oberwald, speculated that the abysmal conditions of psychiatric institutions served to support the dehumanization of the patients. They were often emaciated and dirty, and in being told to commit these crimes, the women were asked to think of the war effort as German citizens, to show mercy and compassion as women, and to act on their training as nurses. To conclude, the end result of all this consideration is to show that euthanasia nurses in the Third Reich cannot be divested from their component identities or the context in which they were living. To simplify this, it is unimaginable that a nurse being asked to kill a patient to save money for the Reich or to preserve good German blood would separate this order from war propaganda telling her that frugality was her responsibility as a woman. It is unimaginable that her training in obedience as a nurse would not find resonance with the duty-bound mentality she was socialized in as a German citizen. It is further unimaginable that her responsibility to obey authority figures, a value taught to Germans in schools at this time, would not be reinforced by the commands of a woman's gendered socialization to be easy to get along with. A nurse is given responsibility for the health of the Volk. A woman is given responsibility for racial purity. Nurses who follow genocidal orders of their superiors are thereby considered good nurses, good women, and good Germans. This research shows that we cannot separate groups of women during the Holocaust as though they're not sharing a context. The tendency to depoliticize women or to talk about socialization of Germans without examining how it affected women as women, or to talk about propaganda and motherhood as if it was only relevant to women who are mothers and nothing else, are all assumptions that prevent us from fully comprehending the context that female perpetrators were living in. To truly understand the motivations and choices of the nurses who participated in euthanasia, we cannot carve them into their attendant parts, but rather we must comprehend them as whole human beings, complex and illogical, maneuvering in an oppressive context that bound them to genocide by manipulating all of their identities together. Thank you.